Good evening, my friends. Welcome. So good to see you, all of you here in Beer Chapel. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm Director of Jewish Culture and Programming here at Central Synagogue. We are so excited to be together tonight to hear from Michael Koplow from the Israel Policy Forum. This is part of a series that we are doing with Israel Policy Forum on Israel's future in focus. There's nobody better to hear from in this moment. So before we start, because I have a captive audience, I want to take the opportunity to remind everybody that we are right now in the midst of the World Zionist Congress elections. World Zionist Congress is how the world, the Jewish world, makes our voices and our values heard in Israel. This election will end up directing $5 billion of support in Israel. We want to make sure that your voices are represented in the room. How do you do that? By voting. It takes 5 minutes. It takes $5. And if you vote reform, which is the third on the slate, you can actually literally elect Angela Bookdahl to be our representative at the World Zionist Congress. And so you voted, I voted. Who already voted? Oh, so many voted already. I actually don't know if we're going to have to hand out a lot of those because it looks like the vast majority of the room has voted already. But if you haven't, we're going to have a QR code that you can take with you that will help you go directly to the voting page as you leave this evening. So, without further ado, our evening will be introduced by our friend and colleague from IPF, Rosa Snyder.
Hi, everyone. Great to meet you or see you again if you were here at the previous sessions. I'm Rosa Snyder. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator at Israel Policy Forum. I'm so excited to present our speaker for tonight, Michael Koplow. He's the Chief Policy Officer for Israel Policy Forum. And he also serves as the Senior Research Fellow for the Kogod Research Center at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He writes Israel Policy Forum's weekly Koplow column, which is a leading source for commentary and analysis on Israel and American Jewry. And his work is regularly featured in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, The Forward, and many other publications. So we're so excited to welcome up Michael.
Hi, everyone. And early wishes for a Chag Sameach and a happy Passover. So there's obviously a lot going on, lots I could talk about. I think I will start with what is going on in Gaza and the West Bank in terms of where we are with various military operations. Maybe talk a little bit about what the Israelis seem to be up to in Syria and Lebanon, and how this ties into U.S. Israel ties at the moment, and then we should have plenty of time for questions to cover whatever people are interested in talking about. So, let's start with Gaza, where at the moment we are in something of a holding pattern or a deadlock. We, of course, had the ceasefire that began on January 19th and formally ended on March 1st, and then the resumption of IDF operations in Gaza on March 18th. And 3 weeks beyond that, we still don't have a lot of answers as to what the Israelis are going to do next. What we have seen so far in Gaza, aside from the resumption of airstrikes, is limited Israeli ground operations that at the moment look in some ways similar to what we saw over effectively 15 months of war, and in some ways look different. The way in which they look similar is that Israel spent a lot of the time during the first campaign in Gaza establishing different security zones inside of Gaza. And so there was the buffer zone along the eastern side of Gaza that runs along the Gaza envelope, the Otef Aza, where the Israeli communities that were invaded on October 7th still lie. There was the Philadelphia corridor, which is the very south of Gaza, separating Rafah from Egypt. There was the Netzarim corridor, which bisects northern Gaza and southern Gaza. And one of the first things that Israel did when it resumed military operations in mid-March, it had never evacuated the Rafah corridor, but it retook the Netzarim corridor, which it had left. It also expanded the security zone along the eastern side of Gaza, and then it carved out a new corridor called the Morag corridor, which effectively splits Rafah from Khan Yunis in central Gaza. And there's talk about creating yet another corridor that will separate Gaza City from the very north of Gaza. And so at the moment, between what Israel did in the Philadelphia corridor and what it did in this new Morag corridor, right now Israel controls, just between those two corridors alone, about 20% of the territory of Gaza. And that's new. That was not something that we saw during the first IDF military operation. In the first operation, Israel was taking some of these corridors and bisecting Gaza into different parts, but much of what it was doing were sort of quickly going through, eliminating nests of Hamas fighters, and then moving on and effectively using these corridors to conduct raids. What we're seeing now is that Israel is starting to take over larger parts of territory and hold it. And this is consistent with a few things that are changed since the last time we had large-scale IDF operations. One big difference is that Israel Katz is now the defense minister, whereas Yoav Gallant was the defense minister for much of the time of Israel's operations in Gaza. And Israel Katz has been saying since he became defense minister that one of the things that Israel is going to do is take territory and keep it. And that is, in his view, going to be an effective way of pressuring Hamas, basically saying to Hamas, this time we're going to hold this territory and keep it perhaps in perpetuity, and every day that goes by where hostages are not released, you are going to lose more and more of the territory of Gaza. One of the other things that is different is that there's a new IDF chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, who replaced Herzi Halevi. And Eyal Zamir is also, I'll say, more hawkish on a number of issues than Herzi Halevi was. And one of the ways in which he is more hawkish, and I think this has to do somewhat with his mindset and his philosophy, but somewhat with his background, is that he is the first ever IDF chief of staff to come from the Armored Corps. He was a tank commander. And one of the things that he believes very strongly is that rather than do what the IDF did the first time around in Gaza, which was to start with airstrikes and then send in ground troops in the north and work their way down south, he is a big proponent of going in with more force in a multi-pronged way, with tanks and with infantry. So we're seeing the multi-pronged way already, in which Israeli forces are operating in different places and retaking the Netzarim corridor and carving out this new Morag corridor. And I think that if IDF operations continue, we're going to see a heavier multi-pronged approach where we see tank operations and heavy ground troops simultaneously in northern, central, and southern Gaza, which would be different from what we saw last time. The question is really whether that's going to happen, or whether we're going to get to another ceasefire and hostage agreement. And here there are conflicting signs, and I think that there are also conflicting variables at play. So on the one hand, the next phase of any negotiation is going to be tougher, and we're seeing that it's tougher already. And the reason is that there are anywhere from 21 to 24 living hostages remaining of the 59 Israeli hostages who are in Gaza. And there has been reporting that when Yahya Sinwar launched the October 7th attacks, his aim was to capture 20 living Israelis as hostages. He thought that 20 was the number that he would need in order to exercise maximum leverage over Israel and get the various things he wanted. Now, he was, in Hamas's view, spectacularly more successful. He didn't get 20, he got over 250. And so in some ways, every hostage, every living hostage above 20 was almost as if Hamas was playing with house money, and they got a lot for it. They've gotten the release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners and terrorists, including very hardcore ones, people who were rightly in Israeli prisons for life. They got extended ceasefires. They got a lot. But we're now down to the number that Hamas thinks it needs to get what it really wants, which is the complete withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza and the end of the war, effectively leaving them in place. And so, as opposed to the last round, where Hamas extracted a heavy price from Israel, but was willing to give back living prisoners without getting its core demands, we're now at the point where releasing certainly all of them, but even I think half of them, is going to be something that Hamas is not willing to do, because we're now at their red line, and they understand what their maximum leverage point is. And from the Israeli point of view, this is obviously unacceptable. The idea that you would leave Hamas in place in Gaza is not something that almost any Israelis are willing to accept, but certainly not this government. And where you have the difference between Israeli public opinion and this government is that overwhelmingly, Israeli public opinion wants to see a deal, even if it involves the withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza, in order to get the living hostages back, because most Israelis believe that at some point, Hamas will violate whatever ceasefire arrangements there are, whatever deal there is, and at that point, the IDF can go back in. This government, however, takes a different approach, and I'm sad to say that that different approach is largely over politics and not over security. And it's because very prominent members of this government, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir most prominently, are unwilling to support the government and stay where they are unless Israel keeps on fighting in Gaza, irrespective of what that means for the hostages. And so we're now at this spot where we have conflicting proposals out there. There is an Egyptian and Qatari proposal that initially was for 5 hostages, unclear how many of those 5 would have been alive, and has now been increased to 8 hostages, again, unclear how many of them will be alive, who would be released over the course of either a 40 or 50-day ceasefire. And at that point, there's supposed to be negotiations again over this idea of phase 2, which would require an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and the end of the war, versus the Israeli proposal that, at least at the moment, has been endorsed by the United States, which is for 11 living hostages to be released on day 1, and then you have a 40 or 50-day period where you negotiate over phase 2, and at the end of that period, the remaining Israeli hostages are supposed to be released. And as I said, that gap maybe sounds like it's theoretically bridgeable, but I think because of the different red lines that Hamas has and the Israeli government has at this point, it's going to be difficult to bridge those proposals and come to something. I sincerely hope that the two sides can agree on something, because there are very few living hostages left, and it's an imperative to bring them all back. And we know what the numbers say. The numbers say that 106 living hostages have come home through negotiations over a ceasefire and hostage release, and 8 living hostages have come home through IDF military operations. So the idea that IDF military operations, even if they are done in a heavier fashion, as the IDF seems to be planning, the idea that that will secure the lives of the remaining hostages, I'm sad to say there's no evidence for that argument. And so the lives of these hostages really do hang in the balance of these negotiations, and the two sides are pretty dug in. Notwithstanding all of that, I think that there still is a question as to what type of IDF operation we're likely to see in Gaza absent a successful negotiation. And that has to do not with the government's preferences and not with the IDF's preferences. That has to do with a basic numbers problem, which is that Israel has been relying on reservists now since October 7th in a very heavy way. And there are reservists who have literally served 300 or 350 days in reserves since October 7th. That is simply not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the reservists themselves in terms of their own mental and physical capacity. It's not sustainable for the Israeli economy. And what we're seeing is that, contrary to the period after October 7th, where you had an over 100% reservist reporting rate, and the way you get to over 100% is that reservists who literally were no longer eligible for reserve service were showing up to their units anyway. My Israel Policy Forum colleague, Hartman, who's our Director of Israel Operations, who, because he's over the age of 40, was not eligible to return to his unit, showed up anyway. They sent him home, but this was typical of many Israelis after October 7th. The reservist reporting rate now has fallen down to somewhere between 40 and 50%. And it's because Israelis are tired and they're questioning what utility there still is to fighting in Gaza, and they have to go back to their jobs, and some of them are getting back to the point that we saw before October 7th of not wanting to serve as a reservist because of other policies that the Israeli government is carrying out. So we have all of these things coalescing at the same time, and for Israel to launch another operation in Gaza that will require a call-up of over 100,000 reservists, it's unclear whether the manpower to do that is actually there. Now, if Israel were only operating in Gaza, maybe the manpower issue would be manageable. The problem is that that's not the only front in which Israel is operating. Since October 7th, there have been increased Israeli operations in the West Bank as well, and particularly since the second ceasefire began on January 19th, those operations have increased. And that also is not primarily for security reasons. That's also been driven by politics. When Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed to the ceasefire on January 19th, he had to do something to placate two people. One was Itamar Ben-Gvir, who left the coalition and said that he would only return to the coalition once the war resumed and if Israel did not move to the second phase of the ceasefire. The other was Bezalel Smotrich, who stayed in the coalition, but he had two demands. One demand was that the ceasefire not extend beyond phase one, and indeed it did not extend beyond phase one. And the other demand he had was that Israel immediately begin a more intense operation inside of the West Bank. And so concurrent with the beginning of the ceasefire in January, we saw Israel immediately move 12,000 more soldiers into the West Bank, erect about 200 new what are called flying checkpoints inside the West Bank, and begin a very intense operation in the northern West Bank, particularly in the Jenin and Tulkarm refugee camps, to take those refugee camps over. And in the process, they displaced 40,000 Palestinians who left Jenin and Tulkarm and are now living elsewhere inside of the West Bank. That operation is now starting to wind down a bit, but we've had it essentially now for almost 3 months. And it was 12,000 additional soldiers who moved into the West Bank immediately in January. It's now up to about 14,000 or 15,000 on top of the soldiers who were there before. So there's a manpower problem not only in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well. And then you have Lebanon and Syria. And there too, we are seeing an increased requirement for Israeli troops. In Lebanon, there are two things that have been happening. One is that there were about 90,000 Israelis who evacuated the north after October 7th, and most of them have not returned. I was up on the Lebanese-Israeli border 3 weeks ago, and I was in Metula, which is the northernmost town, and Metula is still somewhere between 90 and 95% empty. You drive around and you see houses which still have holes in their roofs and the walls from rocket fire from Hezbollah over the course of the war. Since I was there have been new rockets shot not by Hezbollah. It was probably by Hamas in Lebanon, but that were shot at Metula. So for understandable reasons, Israelis have been reluctant to return to the north. And one of the things the government has promised to do is to establish new IDF posts in every single northern community. And so doing that is going to require a lot more people, because that was a relatively lightly defended border before October 7th. The other thing that Israel has done is to establish 5 new IDF posts inside of Lebanon, across from Israeli communities that they did not evacuate during the ceasefire with Lebanon. And Israel has said it's going to remain in those 5 posts until the Lebanese armed forces deploys in a satisfactory manner throughout the entirety of southern Lebanon. Lebanese armed forces, by the way, has been doing a pretty good job, and that's not just my assessment. You hear that if you talk to both U.S. officials and also IDF officials. But the 60-day ceasefire with Lebanon wasn't really a realistic period for the LAF to deploy completely throughout southern Lebanon, and so Israel has remained in those 5 posts, and that requires manpower as well. The real area where we see Israel increasing in the north is in Syria. So when Bashar al-Assad fell, Israel did something that was necessary and I think also smart. The first thing it did was to take over Syrian posts in what was the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, that had been negotiated in 1974 with Syria. And that included Syria's base on the Hartman mountain, which was higher than Israel's base. I was up there too about a month ago in Mitzpeh Shlagim, which is the long-standing Israeli base on the Hartman, and you can see what used to be the Syrian base and is now controlled by Israel, and it's significantly higher than the Israeli base. And from the Syrian, or the former Syrian base in the Hartman, Israel really can see pretty much all of southern Syria. The day I was up there was cloudy, but I'm told that on a non-cloudy day you can see beyond Damascus from that base. And so you can understand why Israel wanted to take that base, and then to also take, it's about a 3 to 5 kilometer DMZ inside of Syria itself. So Israel took that pretty quickly, and Israel also destroyed pretty much all remnants of the Syrian army. Whatever was left of the Syrian Air Force, whatever was left of the Syrian Navy, Syrian weapons factories, a number of Syrian bases. Israel took all of those out in the span of about 3 days, as soon as Bashar al-Assad fell. That was all very smart and required some IDF troops, because you need people on the new base in the Hartman, and if you're going to establish posts in the DMZ itself, that requires some IDF presence, but not a whole lot. But then Israel went beyond that, and basically there are now 3 areas of Israeli concern inside of Syria. The first is, let's call it Area A. Area A there is the Hartman and the DMZ. Then there's another about 17 to 20 kilometer wide zone that let's call Area B, and that's more of a zone of security interest, where the IDF has gone in and established a number of bases and is patrolling, and that's where you have a bunch of Druze villages in southern Syria. And Israel's public rationale for doing that is that it said it wanted to protect the Syrian Druze from either the new Syrian regime or remnants of the old Assad regime. And then there's Area C, which Israel defines as going basically across all of southern Syria, including beyond Damascus, where Israel says it's going to operate to neutralize whatever threats emerge. And that's really code for either Iranian weapons shipments that are now transiting far less frequently since Assad fell, but still exist, and possibly hitting places where the Turks want to set up shop as well, which is what we saw last week when Israel hit 3 air bases inside of Syria. The idea there was to basically deny Turkey access to those air bases. So we're seeing increased Israeli operations in Syria in terms of airstrikes, but also almost by the week an expanding Israeli military presence on the ground in this second zone, this sort of zone of security interest. And by the way, also, it was reported that this is going to start after Passover, but I happen to know it started last week. The IDF is now literally conducting tourism visits to southern Syria for people who want to go and see some of the Druze villages. So anybody who's going to be in Israel for Pesach, you can sign up for an IDF tour of southern Syria if you like. All of this requires people. And so the IDF is spending a lot of manpower in Syria as well. And what I said before about the ostensible public rationale being protecting the Druze, that's not the real reason. The real reason is that Turkey wants to use Syria as its own new base of operations. The Turks see Syria as a sphere of influence that belongs to them. And Israel is basically going tit for tat. And so the Israeli position has been, if Turkey has a presence in northern Syria, which they had under Assad and they've now expanded with the Ashara government, then Israel is going to have a permanent presence in southern Syria. And if Turkey wants to establish bases in Syria, then Israel is going to establish bases in Syria. And this is not something that's going to end anytime soon, because Turkey is indeed determined to use Syria to expand its presence eastward and to use it potentially as a base of operations, but certainly as a base of Turkish influence throughout the region. And Israel views Turkey as I don't know that I would say a hostile actor, but certainly not a friendly actor. And what you hear from talking to Israeli security officials is that the same way that Syria used to be the linchpin of the Iranian axis of resistance, they are concerned that Syria is now going to be a linchpin of effectively a Sunni jihadi axis of resistance, that instead of being spurred on by Iran, will be spurred on by Turkey and possibly Qatar and other Muslim Brotherhood influenced states and movements. The Israelis are far less trusting of Ashara and the Ashara regime than the United States is, for instance. And so we kind of have this developing tit for tat between Israel and Turkey that is not going to wane anytime soon. And so when you take all of this together, Israel is not cutting back on its military operations at the moment. It's expanding them, and that requires people. And so, despite the fact that the Israeli government, I think, very much wants a stepped-up operation in Gaza, and folks from Defense Minister Katz to Finance Minister Smotrich also want to see Israel begin to reoccupy Gaza permanently. There's a clip circulating online from Israeli TV that you can find on YouTube if you wish, of Bezalel Smotrich standing next to one of his kids and promising one of his supporters a few months ago that by Rosh Hashanah of 2025 there would be Israeli settlements back in Gaza, which when he first said I kind of scoffed at, but I'm no longer as skeptical as I was that would happen. That's something that may happen as well, and there are folks in the Israeli government who want to see it. And despite all of that, with Israel's other security priorities, I think they're still debating what they actually want to do in Gaza. Let me talk briefly about Israel-U.S. and then we can go to questions. So all of these things do, of course, impact what's going on between the United States and Israel. Israeli officials were, as I think probably everyone knows, it was very apparent, were very happy with President Trump's return to the Oval Office, and they were happy because it helped the prime minister and his government politically. They were also happy because they viewed this Trump term as something that would be similar to the first Trump term, meaning that whatever Israeli priorities were, they would get to do. And that hasn't, I think those Israeli expectations have been confounded a bit. Now, in some ways, of course, the Trump administration and the Israeli government are very much on board. We don't really see any Trump administration concerns about the scope or nature of Israeli military activities. So there are no disagreements over, for instance, 2,000-pound bombs. There are no disagreements over humanitarian assistance or the lack of humanitarian assistance being facilitated into Gaza. There aren't concerns about IDF strikes that have either killed a large amount of aid workers or operations that have killed U.S. citizens in the West Bank. Those sorts of things that were friction points between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu are now largely gone. But we did see very early on the Trump administration put a priority on a ceasefire and hostage deal. And I don't think that the Israeli government would have agreed to that phase one back in January, absent President Trump, who at the time wasn't even president yet. And even now, while the U.S. and Israel appear to be aligned on what's required for a phase two, I'm not so sure that they're aligned as people think. Even if you saw the way that President Trump spoke on Monday in the Oval Office about the hostages and their plight, he speaks about them far more empathetically than Prime Minister Netanyahu does. And he speaks about the importance of bringing them home far more than Prime Minister Netanyahu does. And I think that we may get to a point where the president and other folks in the administration kind of decide that the war in Gaza has gone on long enough and that it needs to come to an end. And we even got a hint of it in the president's comments on Monday when he talked about the need to end the war itself, which is something that you never hear from the prime minister or members of the Israeli government. So even where it appears that they are very much aligned on that issue, I'm not entirely sure that they're aligned. On other issues, we saw disagreements come to the fore on Monday in a way that we've never seen between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Iran was top of that list. People may have seen reporting today that the Israelis did not know until they arrived at the White House that the administration was about to embark on talks with Iran that are supposed to start on Saturday. From the Israeli perspective, there is no deal with Iran that is a good deal. They don't make a distinction, at least not this government, between a good deal and a bad deal. They don't think that there's a good deal that exists. And so, despite the kind of quick backpedaling that we saw from Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he said while sitting next to the president that he's not opposed to negotiations with Iran, but a deal has to look like complete disarmament. That's not true. He certainly is opposed to any deal, and I think he knows that there is no deal to be had with Iran that will be a complete disarmament and a complete end to the nuclear program. And so that is a gap, a real gap, between the United States and Israel. And one of the things that I think sometimes gets lost here in the U.S. about the Israeli position with regard to Iran is that it isn't a Netanyahu position. It would not matter who the Prime Minister of Israel is, whether it was Netanyahu or Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid or Yair Golan. Any of them, if they were Prime Minister today, would want to launch a military strike on Iran's nuclear program. Full stop. There's no difference between the Israeli government and the Israeli opposition on that issue, and that is not where President Trump, I think, is. He may be there after 6 months or 12 months or 2 years, but he's not there now. And if the Israeli government had its druthers, I think they would have come to D.C. on Monday and spent the meeting in the White House discussing the parameters of a joint U.S. Israel strike on Iran. That's what they want. And I don't think that that is what, as I said, the president wants. And so that's also a real area of disagreement between the two sides. And we may see that break out into the open even more over the coming weeks and months, because right now Israel views Iran as basically wide open. Israel destroyed Iran's air defenses after the ballistic missile attack on Israel in October. Iran is at its weakest point in terms of its proxy network throughout the region. The Trump administration has taken a more muscular approach than the Biden administration did to the Houthis. The Biden folks were conducting airstrikes as well, but the Trump folks have expanded them in a real way. going after not just ports and even military facilities, but going after Houthi leadership, which is easier said than done. I think at some point soon they're probably going to run out of those targets because it's not an issue of military capacity; it's an issue of intelligence. And there isn't that much intel on those guys. It's much more like Afghanistan than like Lebanon. So it's akin to the U.S. operation to get rid of Taliban leadership much more than it is akin to the Israeli operation to eliminate Hezbollah leadership. But it's all putting Iran much more on its back foot, and the Israelis view this as a unique window to strike Iran that may not return. And so the longer that they don't get a green light from the U.S., and the longer that they don't get what they need from the U.S., because while Israel can certainly strike inside Iran on its own, if it wants to hit nuclear facilities that are buried deep under mountains, it needs what's colloquially called the mother of all bombs, 30,000-pound bombs that only the U.S. has, and which for 25 years, dating back to the George W. Bush administration, we have not been willing to sell to the Israelis, despite a quarter century of their requesting them. And Israel also needs B-2 bombers to deliver those bombs, something that they do not have and the United States has. So it isn't just an issue of even a U.S. green light, it's an issue of active U.S. involvement. And I think the longer that Israel does not get that, the longer we're going to see some sort of agitation between the United States and Israel over this issue. So I think I'll stop there. That leaves us 20 minutes for questions, and happy to discuss anything that is on people's minds.
Michal and I will be taking questions from each side of the room, rotating between each.
It just seems like Israel keeps just taking land from these various countries and with no pushback from a national standpoint. I think maybe it's because they're weak enough that they can't respond. But what is the response of the international community, and is that deterring Israel at all?
So I think part of what's going on is that before October 7th, Israel's theory was one of deterrence, right? The idea that you build up the IDF, you conduct strikes when necessary, and that will deter, and you kind of stay on your borders, and that will deter foes. And you rely heavily on technology. After October 7th, that's gone. And Israel's new theory is basically expand the borders of Israel and operate in enemy territory preemptively and proactively, not for deterrence. And so we're seeing that certainly in Syria, and we're seeing it in Lebanon. We're also actually seeing it in the West Bank, where the IDF has said that it's going to establish permanent posts in the Jenin and Tulkarm refugee camps. So we're seeing Israel expand its borders. I think that there hasn't been much pushback, but it's for different reasons in different places. In Lebanon, the Lebanese government is really going out of its way to not get into conflict with Israel. And the Israelis have basically passed on messages to the Lebanese government saying, we don't view these 5 posts as being permanent. Once the Lebanese armed forces deploys to the south and we see them taking care of Hezbollah, we will evacuate those 5 posts. I think that's actually going to happen. It may not be for 6 months or a year or maybe longer, but I think it's going to happen. And so the lack of pushback there is really because the Lebanese government is not going out of its way to try to organize international pushback. On Syria, I think it's a combination of the fact that the U.S. hasn't quite decided yet what it wants to do. Here too, by the way, we saw there's simply no way that Prime Minister Netanyahu, sitting in the Oval Office, was happy with President Trump referring to Turkish President Erdogan as his close friend and saying, I like him and he likes me. Literally 1 week after Erdogan publicly said, Allah should damn Zionist Israel, which was interpreted within Israel as basically saying Israel should be wiped off the map. But I don't think that the U.S. has decided yet whether it wants to support the Ashar regime and provide them with sanctions relief, if they want the Turks to basically take over Syria, if they want an Israeli presence. They just haven't decided. And so the U.S. is not organizing that pushback. The Turks are trying to do it, but Turkey doesn't have a lot of friends these days. The Europeans are not terribly sympathetic to anything the Turks are doing. And you do have some regional pushback from Arab states because the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular would like to, they'd like to see Syria be stabilized. They don't want to see the Turks take over Syria either. They've been spending a lot of time with Ashara, and they also don't view the new Syrian regime as being in the Turkish orbit. But they're trying to kind of push back against the Turks primarily before they're trying to push back against the Israelis, because that's what they see as the real threat in Syria. So in some ways, it's a coordination problem. I think over time, the real deterrence on Israel is not going to be international pushback on this. It's going to be if they go too far in Syria, which they're getting close to. And when I say too far, meaning in a way that's going to spark a Syrian resistance, similar to what you had in Lebanon for 18 years of Israeli presence in southern Lebanon. If that happens, that will be the thing that gets Israel out of Syria, I think, more than any sort of international pushback.
Thanks for doing this. We appreciate it. So I have two questions. I'm interested in the political situation, and I'm interested in the street in Israel. So two things, I guess, would be: do you think, would you bet there would be a vote for a new government at any time prior to when they're supposed to be? And second of all, how does something like what happened last week, where the IDF basically killed a bunch of people in an ambulance, and at first it was reported that they did nothing wrong, and then we had the video, and they obviously did. And I was wondering, I know it's a year and a half after October 7th, but how does that resonate, or does it not at all, with the Israeli street?
All right. So on the first question about political stability, the reason that Prime Minister Netanyahu was so willing to basically give in to whatever Ben-Gvir and Smotrich wanted was because the government had to pass a budget by March 31st. Otherwise, it would trigger automatic elections. That budget did indeed pass. And so that means that there is no external way to bring down this government for another year until the end of next March. Now, there may be, coalitions in Israel are generally brought down from the inside, not the outside. And so that may still happen, but I think it's unlikely. I think that this government is now going to survive until the end of its term, or until Prime Minister Netanyahu decides that it's a politically advantageous time for him to call snap elections. So this government right now is at maximum stability. Smotrich is living out his best life in terms of what he's getting done in the West Bank, which I haven't really talked about, but maybe worth spending a minute or two on. Ben-Gvir will leave the government when he thinks it's advantageous for him, because he's going to run to Netanyahu's right. He views himself, as appalling as this may be, he views himself as a future Israeli prime minister, and he thinks that the path to that is basically seizing all the territory to Netanyahu's right. So he may leave the government at some point, but he doesn't have the numbers to bring it down. And at this point, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, they haven't gotten their draft law. They probably aren't going to get it, but they also know that if they want subsidies to keep flowing, that lies with this government. They basically called Netanyahu's bluff, or Netanyahu called their bluff, and they're not leaving. So this government is stable; it's not going anywhere. On the question of what Israelis think about the killing of Red Crescent workers inside of Gaza and the West Bank, it's sadly not getting a lot of traction inside of Israel. And the IDF flat out lied about the incident in Gaza. They were forced to retract once the New York Times got its hand on actual video of it. And they say they're investigating it, but it turns out that, and they've actually now they've suspended and court-martialed a number of the commanders involved, because it turns out that the platoon commander flat out lied in his own report back to the IDF. And in the West Bank, frankly, there are incidents that have been as bad, if not worse, and more widespread. There have been literal pogroms carried out by IDF troops inside the West Bank and Palestinian villages now for months. including a bunch that have happened on video. And there too, we are seeing efforts from the IDF to discipline those troops. Eyal Zamir, the new chief of staff, went and spoke to the brigade that carried out the latest one in Jibna in person. Also, a number of people involved there have been suspended and jailed already. But there's no question to me that the IDF has a real discipline problem. These incidents were not taken seriously after October 7th, I think because Israelis' blood was literally still boiling, and hostages were still there, as they still are. And I think the widespread sentiment was there may be some bad apples, but this is just not the priority at the moment. And it's now at the point where troops who served for hundreds of days in Gaza and basically had carte blanche are still operating that way. Many of them have now been moved to the West Bank, which is a different situation, but because they spent hundreds of days conditioned to think that anybody they encounter is Hamas terrorists, they're still operating with that mindset in the West Bank, and that's just not the situation in the West Bank at all. And so we're seeing more and more really, really bad behavior. And like I said, the IDF seems to be taking it a bit more seriously than they have been, but it's really not on the radar of the Israeli public. You see it reported increasingly in the Israeli press, but I haven't detected much angst about it amongst Israelis, and it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem in terms of what's happening day to day and the impact on Palestinians, and it's a huge problem in terms of the long-term viability of Israeli military discipline and the IDF's ability to function as an army that has basic rules it abides by. So it's really concerning.
Hi, over here. Good to see you again. Regarding a hostage deal, everyone I think in this room wants the hostages to come home, but it seems to me that you haven't really addressed the core of the counter argument to making a deal. So if I could maybe steelman that argument and ask for your response. I believe years before October 7th, there was a similar kind of hostage deal where something like 1,000 terrorists were released in exchange for one Israeli soldier, because we believe in bringing home these hostages. And one of those 1,000 terrorists that was released, I forget the exact number, but one of those...
I think it was 1,037.
Right. And one of them was Yahya Sinwar, who launched October 7th, took 251 hostages, killed 1,200. We all know this. It seems to me that the counter-argument is that there's a choice to be made now between the 59 souls that are still held captive in Gaza and the next October 7th, where another 251 people might be taken, another 1,200 people might be killed. And so I'm curious what your response to that argument is, because it seems like a real moral dilemma, and I don't necessarily begrudge people for not jumping at a deal because we may be setting up the next October 7th.
Yeah, so there absolutely is that other side to this, and you hear that from some Israelis. Like I said, 70% of Israelis support a deal, and 30% do not, and that's the main argument that you hear from the 30%, and it's a valid argument. And I'll note, by the way, that in real time in 2011, I was opposed to the Gilad Shalit deal for that reason. And it isn't, by the way, it's not just that Sinwar was released. He was literally the number one person on the list. He was the first person to walk out. And yes, we saw what the impact of that was. So that argument is 100% valid. I don't dismiss it as invalid or illegitimate in any way. I think there are a few differences, though. One is that Gilad Shalit was a soldier, and as difficult it is to see soldiers in horrible captivity at the hands of terrorists, soldiers sign up for a mission, and as painful as it may be, sometimes they have to give their lives. In this case, certainly with the previous rounds of ceasefire and hostage deals, we're talking about Israeli civilians, and that's a different category entirely. And I think that any state owes a duty to civilians who have been taken hostage by terrorists that makes the price far heavier, but also more important to pay in terms of getting them back. And of the 59 who were there, Hamas defines any Israeli male of fighting age to be a soldier. And so their claim is that everybody who's left is a soldier. Not all the people left are actually soldiers. There's still civilians there. And I think that getting them out is critical. And also, as I said earlier, Israel has now released well over 1,000 terrorists, and a fair number of them are in the Yahya Sinwar category. They're absolutely going to return to terrorism against Israel. At this point, that's been done. So holding the line now and saying, well, we released this many, but we're not going to release more. I don't know that what the marginal cost is of every increased terrorist that gets released. But given who's already gotten out at this point, to me, getting the living Israelis back is an imperative, and it isn't necessarily going to create a bigger security problem than Israel is going to have to face anyway. And third, Israeli security doctrine has changed as a result of October 7th, in some ways for better, in some ways for worse. I think that the chances of a surprise attack along those lines now are effectively zero. I think that a lot of the people who've been released are going to find themselves either killed or back in prison before too long. Already, by the way, we've seen some of the people who've been released in previous deals already rearrested or killed. So I think Israel is going to take a pretty heavy hand with regard to a lot of these guys. So, like I said, I don't dismiss the counter argument at all. I think it's valid and legitimate, but those are the reasons why I am on the other side of it.
As far as I know, it's the first time in history that we've sent 1/3 of the B-2 fleet, $12 billion of merchandise, to Diego Garcia, which is comfortably within striking distance of Iran. And my experiences, as with the aircraft carriers at the beginning with vis-a-vis the Lebanon situation, the people don't just do this for some kind of childish game, that it's done with great seriosity. And so I'm curious as to how you put that factoid together with your assessment of Monday.
So the buildup in Diego Garcia of the fleet and B-2 bombers, I think you can read it in a number of ways. So one way to read it, and this, by the way, is how many folks in the region are reading it, based on conversations I've had with Israelis and Emiratis and Jordanians over the last few days, they view it as a precursor to a U.S. strike on Iran. So that's certainly one way of interpreting it. I think another way of interpreting it is Trump has wanted talks with Iran. He's been very clear about that. And I think he's also viewed the threat of military pressure as the way to get those talks. Similar to, we've seen the president's back down on tariffs today. I think he may view the buildup in Diego Garcia similar, right? You send all this hardware as a way of saying, I'll do it, and then you force talks. So it may have been in service of that announcement on Monday that talks will start. And like I said, I don't think that he's going to let talks go on indefinitely. I think that if they fail, he will come to the Israeli position at some point. And so it may be that he wants to keep that stuff there for a strike if and when talks fail. It also may be that, given the stepped-up campaign in Yemen, they want the B-2 fleet in Diego Garcia to carry out strikes in Yemen too. So I think any of those is possible.
Okay, we have about 3 more minutes, so we have time for either a quick 2 or one longer.
Hi, just a quick question. You can talk about Saudi Arabia, the Abraham Accords. Are they going to be expanded at all? Do you have an opinion on that? And the second question, albeit related, you said talk a little about like Arab Israelis, how they view this whole situation.
How they view which whole situation?
The whole war and everything. They just
got it. Sure. So on the second one, Israelis at this point, as I said, 70% of them they want a deal. They'll end the fighting and get the hostages back. There certainly is still support for the war, but their imperative is the hostages. And many Israelis have the mindset that they're going to be at war in some way, shape, or form for a while. that this is a longer term thing, that at this point it's kind of Fortress Israel and they can't trust anybody and threats are all around them. And I've rarely seen Israelis as pessimistic about kind of the long-term prospects of what it means to be an Israeli. On Saudi normalization at the moment, it's completely dead. The Saudis absolutely cannot and will not move forward while they're still fighting in Gaza. They cannot and will not move forward absent some sort of longer term resolution to what happens in Gaza. They cannot and will not move forward without some sort of what they view as credible movement toward resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not just with regard to Gaza, but with regard to the West Bank. And since October 7th, Israel, which frankly most Saudis before October 7th didn't terribly care that much about, like the Israeli-Palestinian issue for this generation of Saudis was not nearly as prominent. It's been on the news 24/7 for a year and a half, and Israel is far less popular in Saudi now than it was a year and a half ago. I've heard off the record from Saudis that MBS, the Crown Prince, actually has fears for his own personal safety these days because of what's going on in Gaza and the perception that he'd be willing to normalize with Israel and sell out Palestinians. So while I think Israel-Saudi normalization is still something that will happen at some point, at the moment it's completely dead.
So with that hopeful note, Michael, thank you for sharing your time, your expertise, your insight with us. We're so grateful.